So we've talked about the bookends now, right? We've talked about how the human tells the system what to do. We've talked about when this system arrives at its destination, what does it do, and how does it do it in a interoperable way with any sort of payload, within some sort of design bounds. Well, what about this magic that happens in the middle, right? So how do we get there? And how do we get there if we don't have any information about the world around us? Again, data denied or GPS denied environments. And there's quite a few steps that you're going to hear about, but we're going to start with Spencer. And I'll introduce Spencer to talk to you about GPS denied navigation.
Hello, everybody. I'm Spencer. So I'm going to be talking about robust GPS denied navigation. I'm from Western Michigan University. I'm going on to University of Colorado Boulder for my master's. So to start off with, the Agile Workflow here was very helpful for me, as they have already explained. For me, a lot of times this was exploratory, trying to figure out the best way to make this robust. And a lot of times I went forward, hit a wall, was like, okay, left or right? We went left. Hit another wall. All right, well, let's go back and go right. Oh, hit another wall. It's like a maze. So eventually we found our way forward. So that's kind of what's going on. There's kind of a picture up there in the upper right of the camera that I was using for how we were going to do this GPS denied navigation. So the mission, navigate to a general area, step 5. That's important. So at one of these phases, we will not be having GPS. We won't be using GPS. It will be available, but we'll be like, yeah, let's act like it doesn't exist. And we'll have to fly to the area to find the package and pick it up and return it back to home. So my objectives was, all right, we need some software to do this GPS denied or degraded or disabled navigation. So disabled GPS basically means we have it, we're choosing not to use it. Denied, we don't have it, like the surface of Mars. There's no GPS there. And degraded means you have it, but it's not very good, so you're flying between like a bunch of buildings in a city like New York. And navigation is where are we in the world, which GPS is very good for. And so the way we're going to do this is exploring sensor fusion, taking a bunch of different sensors, fuse them all together, and hopefully that will increase our estimate of where we are in this world. And we're building this on top of our current work in visual odometry, which is basically using a camera to tell us, hey, where are we based on the last couple images and so. So the approach I used, wrote almost all my code in C++ and was working in the Robot Operating System, or ROS, and data distribution service, and those are two middlewares basically used to communicate between processes and transfer data from one machine to another machine and one process to another process. And I also wrote Python and MATLAB analysis scripts to basically take data, see how well our SVO algorithm was working and our different GPS denied navigation, how much error did we have, how much drift did we have, and then use that to calculate that. And so the methods I was using to do this, as I kind of mentioned before, was sensor fusion, and the implementation was common filters. And so that's just one way of fusing data. And to do a bunch of analysis, we took flight testing data, and then we also did video playback, basically taking data, running it back, and post-processing it, and changing parameters and seeing what worked best. So the hardware. So we have this Blue Fox camera, which I have a little example of right here, and it's also on board the vehicle over there next to the little LiDAR on the bottom. So it's a small resolution, 750 by 480 gray camera with global shutter. So global shutter is different from what most cameras run as a rolling shutter. And rolling shutter basically takes each pixel and saves it at a time going down and forth. Global shutter takes all the pixels at once and saves it. And so rolling cameras, when you're moving, you start getting motion blur. And the advantage of this camera is we have a nice lens, so we have a nice high field of view. Then we were like, all right, well, this is just a camera, what else do we want to add? So we looked at an inertial measurement unit, our IMU. And so we had the Fidget 1044 IMU, which is sitting right over here. And this is a small little block. And it's a high resolution IMU. It's about middle range, not like the $1 million ones you put on a satellite, but good enough for our vehicle. And so it has two accelerometers, 2 gyroscopes, and 2 magnetometers all fusing together to give us a good estimate of what's going on with our different vehicles. So we can see, oh, are we moving left? Are we moving right? Are we going up? Are we going down? And this is all being processed on an Odroid XU4. And so an Odroid is a single board computer with an octa-core, basically having 8 cores, and the 4 big and 4 little, and it's all on this little board right here. So very small. We have 2 of them sitting on this OG over here. So milestones, this is kind of how my process went through. First thing we had to do was decide how we're going to approach this fusion problem. There's 2 big ways we could have done this. Multi-sensor fusion, which was all existing code, basically developed by some really good prominent scientists in UAVs, or use this other group, Georgia Tech's SLAM library, which had a bunch of sources. The advantage of the multi-sensor fusion was the code already existed, we just had to modify it. Georgia Tech was building our own solution from pre-existing tools. So we decided to go with multi-sensor fusion. And we went forward with this, and then we realized, oh, look, our visual odometry algorithm has some problems. So we had to go back, take a step back, go into the visual odometry problem and fix this. And then we did this by doing some trajectory snap fixes. And we're using thresholds, and I'll explain a little bit later, but basically if our camera thinks we're going this way, but we're actually going this way, we had to realign the trajectory because small errors and angles start adding up over a long period of time. And so moving forward after doing that, I had to build bridges, and this bridge is basically connected to two middlewares, ROS and DDS, together so they could communicate because they're two different systems. And then continuing forward even further, we realized that, oh, look, MSF really doesn't work. Let's just ignore that and go in a different direction. And lastly, I worked to just quantify the performance that we currently had with our visual odometry, which is the semi-direct visual odometry. So going into a little bit more of the low level how this vision algorithm works, which is the primary basis. We have up here a motion thread. The motion thread basically is where is the camera by looking at images. So say we're running somewhere in there and we have two images. We have the new one and we have a previous one. First thing we do is we look at the contrast changes between the two, look at photometric error, and we can get an initial estimate where our camera is relative to these two images. And we move forward with that with this camera. Well, we've also been building a map of all the previous images we had, and we have keyframes. Those are basically images that we really like that had distinguishable landmarks. Say you're in a room and somebody closed your eyes and moved you to a different part, you open your eyes, you're like, hey, I know I've seen that building before, I know where I am. That's basically how it works. And so we do that to further refine our position estimate because the first method wasn't good enough. And then we take that and we now have a better estimate, but now it might not be optimized with the last 10 or so camera positions we've had. So when we go back and we take all those positions, all those images, realign them all so they all match together. And this is basically just the motion thread. We take that extra new camera, the image, or the new frame, and we pass it into our mapping thread, which basically decides whether or not we want to add this to the map or leave it as its own. So the first thing we decide is it a keyframe? So do we think it's good enough? And this is kindly determined by, all right, do we no longer see the previous keyframe, so we need a new one. And so what we do is if we decide it's a keyframe, we extract new features. These are three-dimensional features using a depth filter in build. Basically, a camera normally only sees an X and a Y position, but if you take enough images over time, you can kind of say, oh, I think that's that far away in the Z direction. And so using that, we can kind of converge this keyframe and be like, okay, this is where we think it is. It's really good value, and we pass it into the map. So now we use that for further refinement of where we are in the world. And so then this is passed on into basically our main processing, takes the data, spits it out to everything else. So we look at this current camera pose, and we say, is this a reasonable value? The first way we do that is says, is it even a number? Sometimes it spits out non-numbers, and so we don't want to use those. We just throw it out. And then we look at, for that trajectory snap, I said, we look at the threshold. Did it go too far? You know, if we're moving at 10 centimeters a second and the next position it says we're 20 meters forward, we say, whoa, that's not possible. Let's go back. And we pull this position back and this orientation back to what we know our vehicle is doing. So we use that and we go on to our trajectory snap. So from there, we basically combine this new position where our camera says we are and all of our previous known information of where our camera's been, and we add that together to get our current position in the world. And then we publish it out so everybody else can know where we are too. And so while this is going on in the front, this is all going on in the back that I've helped add on to increase our feature and our capabilities with this algorithm. So we have initialization. So we can basically pass in initialization information, whether it's the vehicle when we start up and we take off to some altitude, we say, hey, this is where the vehicle is in the world because we knew where we started. Pass this into SVO so it says, okay, now I knew where I started. Or we can use Vicon if we're indoors, so we have all these sensors basically telling where the vehicle is relative to the room. A reset command basically clearing all the information in our algorithm so that way we don't have anything we built up. If there was any error earlier before, we delete it so we're fresh start. The VO break, which I kind of talked about with the trajectory snap, a little bit more detail into that. So we store all these snaps together because occasionally it might break multiple times in a row. And all these trajectories are based on the last trajectory. So if I really am going straight, but it keeps thinking I'm going this way, we have to realign all these to straight. So we have to take all this information and constantly realign it. And eventually, that just becomes too big, so we have to basically eliminate that and regenerate it and store it back as the track offset, which we do in this VO reset. So basically, we take that current track and that previous track, and we add them together, so now we know all of our previous states. And then we zero it out, so that way we don't have to deal with any more trajectory snapping at the current point. And so here is a video of this performance running in real time. It's going to be shown in ROS visualization. So in the bottom left corner, you have basically the live feed of the camera overlaid with features from SVO. The little green dots are the features. And when you see there's lines wrong, that's when SVO loses track because it mixes up features and needs to readjust. Right now, you can see the vehicle reinitialize. So I pressed the reinitialization command. That's where the vehicle actually was in the world. As you can see, before that, it was kind of offset. In this algorithm, in this visualization tool, we can actually see three-dimensional location of the image. And you can see as we rotate around, SVO is telling us exactly where we are in this room in three-dimensional space and time. So I'll let that finish playing. And so going through many different playbacks and from indoors and outdoors, I was able to quantify how well this is performing. And so if we're running indoors, the algorithm runs basically in 2 cores no matter what. But in indoors, we're looking at 50 frames per second on these little flat maps that we use as our distinguishable features as at the ground. But when we took it outside, we were showing only 20 to 30 frames. And this might have been because we had issues with saving the data and recording it, whether it was because the Odroid couldn't handle running the algorithm and saving this data, or just the outdoor features are different than our indoor features, and it's a problem with our simulation of these features on the floor. We also noticed that indoors, when you're moving, if we move faster than 30 centimeters per second, we started lagging behind. So if this is where the vehicle actually was, this is where we were publishing. And it was always kind of a lag. And so that's kind of a problem. If we want to stay up to date all the time, we might overpass a waypoint and then be like, oh crap, we already been there, and we already drifted past it. Notice that error is a function of motion, not exactly just any type of motion. So if you're doing a straight line, you exhibit constant error. You don't really drift. You just have the same bounded box. You just keep going back and forth. It's just not the right error. So you might be off by a meter in the front and might be a half a meter off in the back. But if you do a box and a triangle, so if you do like a box, which I did earlier, you start drifting over time. So slowly that box starts shifting through time and adds up much more error. And to try to reduce this, I experimented with different SVO parameters, looking at the number of keyframes, the size of the grid basically number of pixels we use to calculate where that feature, three-dimensional feature is. Looked at the number of images we went backwards to readjust. And we also looked at the number of features. What we saw was that, surprisingly, we didn't expect this, the grid size actually increased performance significantly. On the left, you see the normal values that we run with, a grid size of 20, and you can see this yellow line kind of starting up in the upper left, kind of come over here, up here, and it kind of comes down, and then we do the straight line, and then we do the triangle, and slowly we drift over 5 meters after this trajectory of about 100 meters. We increase the grid size, and you can see it's almost consistently within 1 or 2 meters, and by the end, we're actually sub-meter accuracy in our current position. Unfortunately, this increases our computational complexity, so it cannot run on real time on the Odroid. So we have to solve that problem, which brings us to what we need to do next. So first thing we need to do, speed up the performance. As I said, it can't run on that, but we want it to run on the Odroid, or we're going to have to upgrade the Odroid to something bigger. So speeding up performance, adding in IMU, which was the first intended go, but we always looked on the outside of SVO, our algorithm. So we were like, hey, let's do it post SVO. But really what we need to do is do it inside SVO and solve all the problems there. The other thing, simultaneous localization and mapping. So right now the mapping only stores the last 20 or so, 30 frames, whatever we specify, and then it just rewrites them. If we stored all the frames over the entire time we were flying, or previous flights, we could then just use that reference instead of generating a new map every time we fly. And so those are 3 options. And so where would these fit inside SVO? So up there in the upper left, we could parallelize those 2 areas where we're actually doing the calculations with the images. We can also add IMU information to estimate where that first camera pose is instead of using the camera images. In the VO node, we could just fuse the IMU information during that trajectory snap. Instead of using thresholds, we can say, hey, how much is the IMU saying we moved? Compare that to how much the SVO is moving and try to figure out the right balance. And in the back ends, we can use the IMU to trigger initialization. When you take off, you start off with basically no changes in accelerometer. Then you take off, so you're going to get a massive jump in accelerations. And then when you get to hover mode, you're basically not going to have any accelerations again. So you can say, all right, we reached this point, and now we're steady again. Let's initialize SVO. So you could use that to trigger initialization. And then also for VO, you can basically say, hey, every time we reset, we have to pause the visual odometer. Everything has to restart. And that's times when we're flying. So if we add an IMU estimation for that, now we no longer have small pauses, even though they might be microseconds long or 1 or 2 milliseconds long. That adds up over time. If we initialize 10 or 16 times, we'll slowly add up error, and that could help reduce the error there. And so, kind of summarizing all the technical work with the visual odometry element, it has the potential to perform the requirements for the demo. We can fly distances, we've tested it, and we've known that we can publish out the GPS information. The problem is, the longer we want to fly, or the farther we want to fly, we have to minimize more error so we can get within that bounded area of finding, hey, there's the package. Looking at that multi-sensor fusion, it has really strong performance capabilities, but it's just not useful for our spring demo with our current architecture. And then, as I mentioned earlier, all the future work of integrating sensors needs to happen internal to SVO rather than external. So what have I learned from this experience? Well, documentation is extremely important, whether that's the coordinate frames and the reference systems, to which software is running on which ODroid, on which vehicle, and which vehicle has which ODroids, and all that kind of stuff, the configuration management. When you're doing testing, you do not rush, ever. You want to plan, prepare, and then test. So make sure you have like a checklist if you have to, and just go through the steps saying, we've done this, we've done this, we've done this. Okay, now we can start. Experience with the agile development, more experience with Git. Got to work with the Vicon motion system, and then DDS, the data distribution service. I'd like to thank my fearless mentors, Locke and Jim, for helping me out on this and guiding me along the way. The intern coordinators, Christine and Jada, for bringing me here and setting everything up. And then support of the rest of the AI team, who I could go to anybody for the question and work with to solve problems. And lastly, all the vehicles that we kind of abused on our way of getting here and figuring out what the proper solution was to be, which would be all those listed in the very bottom. Now that is the end. Does anybody have any questions?
Any questions for Spencer?
Spencer.
Yes, Jim?
Questions I asked everyone. So, what you've learned over the semester, has it changed the way your academic career is moving? Are you going to take this and study SLAM and SVO or other visual odometry methods?
So I've explored into those visual odometry algorithms before, and I think that's part of the reason why Locke was like, hey, come over here and help us. But I've got a better feeling and better learning on that, so I've only briefly explored, like, oh, this is what it is. This is how it kind of works. Now I have a much better in-depth understanding, and I really like the idea of doing the sensor fusion and doing state estimation with cameras and figuring out this true solution for GPS denied anywhere, everywhere, to having sub-meter accuracy over millions of meters of travel distance.
It's an incredibly difficult field.
Yes.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
So I'll ask a question. So you talked about the challenges that we've encountered internally, as Jim pointed out. Visual odometry is a challenge, right?
Yes.
Are the challenges that we faced unique to our solution, or are these challenges in general when we're talking about GPS denied? Yeah.
Definitely challenges in general. Certain schools come up with different solutions, and they work in specific cases. Other people come up with solutions in specific cases. They don't work in every case, so they have to have some kind of solution that they provide, like, hey, it works with these specific things. And of course they don't tell you that. They're like, it works. You travel 50 meters and you get 1 centimeter error, but we were going like inch per inch, so you have to kind of read in between the lines when you read papers.
So you're saying YouTube lies?
Yes, YouTube and scientific articles mislead you.
That might be the sin of omission, perhaps. Yeah. So another message about how hard these problems are, and that these aren't solved problems, despite what you see on YouTube. This is a really tough area to be working in. So thank you once again, Spencer.